Hey everybody. So being my first live stream in almost a year, um, I want to jump back in. I understand not um, a lot of people going to join us this time around, but I am very excited for. Um, Hopefully, people can just go back and watch it. I'm going to have it still listed on the YouTube channel, um, and that's my hope. So putting two presidents together, mostly because William Henry Harrison really, I mean, he was president for just a little over a month, and most of that time he was sick. So um, not a lot to talk about except like his early history. And I think the campaign where he was fighting against Martin Van Buren is pretty interesting. So I thought I'd kind of put them together. Um, their presidencies are tied pretty much together. But when we start talking about John Tyler, which if you're interested, the book for John Tyler will be John Tyler, the Accidental President by Edward C. Krappel, like Krappel. um, so that one is free right now on Audible. So if you have an Audible account, you just go and you can download John Tyler, the Accidental President. That's going to be the next president. He basically, when William Henry Harrison died, he was like, I guess I'm president now, and just started being the president. And they didn't really have a plan for when a president died in office, but he made the best of it and said, all right, it's my job. Thanks. Y'all go home now. So let's start with old Martin Van Buren. He was so with Andrew Jackson, nicknames started, and Martin Van Buren had many nicknames. He was the Little Magician, Old Kinderhook, Martin Van Ruin. So obviously his presidency didn't go very well. But he was really, really good at political maneuvering, and he did really well with that. He was the 8th president of the United States. He was born December 5th, 1782, first president to be born after the Revolutionary War was complete. And then he died 7/24/1862. So, and interesting enough, he was born in Kinderhook, New York, and they were very like Dutch. They weren't Amish, but they were like a Dutch cultural area. So Dutch was actually his first language. He had to learn English second, and he also was the first president who was elected who did not have any British ancestry. He was fully Dutch, and they kind of intermarried a bunch. So his second cousin was his wife. Her name was Hannah Hose. And they were married in 1807, in February in 1807 in Catskill, New York. They had 6 children, one who died in childbirth. But 4 boys and a girl. So, yeah, in the few short years they were married before she died of tuberculosis, they had a lot of children. That's probably pretty common back in that day. Supposedly he loved her so much that he really had a hard time talking about her through the rest of his life. And when he wrote his autobiography, he actually never mentioned his wife, Hannah. And he never married again. So it was interesting. His whole time as president, he was not married. But he was always upheld as a very honorable, like loving man. So it's very unlikely he was having affairs. It could have, but most people believe he didn't. He joined politics in New York back in 1812. He was a New York State senator, then a U.S. senator. Then very short, he was the governor of New York. And he said he would run. Like a bunch of people wanted him to run for governor of New York. New York, I can say that, I swear. But he said, I'm going to, if Andrew Jackson needs me, I'm going to go and work in his cabinet, and I'll resign from governorship, and which is what happened. He served for about a month and a half, and then he went to go be the Secretary of State for Andrew Jackson. And then he also resigned from the Secretary of State to go for some political maneuvering stuff. I'll get into that in just a minute. He was a lawyer, but he never went to college. Back then, lawyers studied under another lawyer, learned law, and then started practicing themselves. He did pass the bar exam in the state of New York. So he was an official lawyer, but he never went to college, which is kind of interesting. He was elected for one term as president in 1837 to 1841. Let's see here. I got a lot of notes. All right. He was only 5'6" and was the second shortest president at that time, right after James Madison. If you're on the Discord, you'll see I actually went to Washington D.C. with my wife. We had like a weekend date. We spent a couple days in D.C. and got to see a lot of the presidential stuff that I had. Sorry, I had like something in my eye. We got to see a lot of that presidential stuff. There's so much, like, as I'm reading these biographies, I'm learning about building names and how things went, and like the War of 1812 and why this was built, why that was built. All these things went to the Jefferson Library, which I posted some pictures on the Discord, and stood in front of the Madison Library, but didn't actually go into that one. We could have, but we needed to get I guess when you go and you want to do tours of these places, they're free. But you contact, hey, Carlos, how's it going, buddy? You contact your state legislator, and they put in for you to get tickets. And so I only got I only got the tickets that we didn't get White House. We didn't get any of that other really cool stuff. But the Thomas Jefferson Library is still pretty neat. And because we went on the right day, we got to go down to the reading area because nobody was reading that day. So we got to go down there instead of like, they've got like this high window where you can watch from and look down in. And we actually got to go down in that area. We got to look because there's nobody working that day. All right. So he was, so I don't know what a surrogate is, but his first official public office was he was a surrogate of Columbia County from 1808 to 1813. Then he won the New York Senate seat for the Middle District, and that's when his rivalry with DeWitt Clinton started. And then he became the Attorney General of New York from 1815 to 1819. But DeWitt Clinton, when he became governor of New York after he was a state senator and then became the attorney, he was actually both at the same time. So he was state senator and he was attorney general. And at that time, his wife died of tuberculosis. So they were trying to get the Erie Canal from the ocean to Lake Erie so that ships can go back and forth. And they were working together on that. And whenever all that got settled up, DeWitt Clinton didn't need him anymore. He replaced him as attorney general. So they were definitely not friends. They kind of fought one another in the New York State House all the time. And then after that, he went to run for the U.S. Senate seat of New York. He won that in 1821, and he served there until 1828, when he agreed to become the governor of New York for 3 months. And then he became the Secretary of State under Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and him and Jackson. I'll go into that in a minute. But like their careers are so tied together. Their rise and fall are both tied together. And then that lasted most of his term, but he engineered this really interesting coup kind of thing where he resigned for a different. He wanted to go be the foreign minister to Great Britain, and then he got Andrew Jackson to basically clear house on his cabinet, redo his whole cabinet, and he went to England with his son, his oldest son, and then so the Senate kind of figured out what he was doing and said, no, we're not going to confirm you as the minister to the UK, and pulled him back. So when he got back, Andrew Jackson made him vice president. So they tried to mess with him, and it didn't work. And he went even higher up. So he went from Secretary of State, didn't get the UK foreign minister, and then he became the vice president. And then so Jackson basically told everybody as he was finishing up his term, I want this to be the next president. He has my blessing, all that kind of stuff. So Van Buren, during all this time, He he really was the architect of the Democratic Party. Jackson is the face of the Democratic Party when it was formed. If you guys remember when we were talking about Monroe, Monroe was so popular that basically they went down to one party. They went down to a Democratic Republic, which is what Jefferson and Madison and Monroe all were. They were Democratic. So the Federalists, which Washington and Adams and Alexander Hamilton were, their party kind of just died. They lost so much popularity that the Democratic Republicans were basically, that's all there was. So when Van Buren came into the U.S. Senate, he hated that. He hated the fact there was only one party, and he really got behind the idea that we need to have these core ideas, which is now what they would call Jacksonian democracy, and really what we know now as the Democratic Party. So Jackson and Van Buren really were the architects of this Democratic Party. And so he was so good at the political machine. That's why they called him the Little Magician. That was his early nickname. And all the presidents for a while there had nicknames. You had Old Hickory for Andrew Jackson, the Little Magician for Martin Van Buren, the William Henry Harrison, who we'll talk about in a minute. His was the Old Tippecanoe. And then John Tyler was the accidental president. So Andrew Jackson's actions removing the charter from the Second Bank of the United States, where he took, so the Second Bank of the United States was the one that was formed after the First Bank of the United States was set up by Alexander Hamilton. Seemed like a good idea. It basically bought all the old state debts, put them together, and used that for credit. Really did a great job making the U.S. economy strong. And through that strength, what they did is kind of forged the U.S. economy. And so that when that ran out, I think it was Jefferson was like, no, I don't think we want to do that anymore. Mostly because it had to do with Hamilton. They weren't friends, and all that was a bunch of political drama. And then so the Second Bank of the United States was formed, and he was like, okay, I'm fine with that because it's not Hamilton's idea. And so Andrew Jackson was like, I hate this idea. I want to take all of our money out of these banks, and then I want to give it to banks that I like, small state banks. And it was horrible for the U.S. economy. Basically, these banks were given all this kind of money, and they gave out loans to anybody and everybody. And the economy was just trashed. And Andrew Jackson was like, this is the greatest thing I've ever done. I'm so smart. And we put him on the $20 bill for some reason. He like the worst financial crisis in our history up to that point was the Panic of 1837. And it proves so much of how it was Andrew Jackson's fault, because it happened 3 months into Martin Van Buren's presidency. And everybody, because they love Jackson so much, they were like, oh, it's Martin Van Buren's fault. And he got the nickname Martin Van Ruin, like R-U-I-N, Ruin. Sorry, I don't know. I mumble sometimes. Man, it was so many bad things happening over and over and over to him. You had the Panic of 1837, horrible economic stuff. And then Andrew Jackson signed the proclamation that moved all the southeastern tribes out to Oklahoma. And it was Martin Van Buren's job to uphold that thing that he signed. Now, he was a huge part of that. He was advising, as the vice president, Andrew Jackson, to do the Indian Removal Act, is what it was called at the time. And so that started a second Seminole War, which threw the country into even more economic turmoil, because we had to send so many soldiers down to Florida to fight the Seminole Indians. For me, as a Floridian, Andrew Jackson is not somebody I like. I remember learning about how bad Andrew Jackson was, and all of us Floridians were taught in school like how bad this guy was. So already I had a bad view of him coming into the biography, and he didn't make it any better. He was not a good man. And then he was so popular, though, that all of his bad things were thrown on Martin Van Buren's shoulders, and he just had to stomach the load of it. It was awful. He also, because he was such a political guy. Now, one of the coolest quotes I heard about him was they were saying, like, we went to go ask Martin Van Buren a question, And at the end of a 30-minute conversation, we still had no idea what he was standing for. Like, he talked us in circles so much that we had no idea what we had no idea what his position was. So he didn't want to allow Texas into the Union because it was a slave state. So it had won its independence from Mexico, and through that, it really wanted to be an American state. And Martin Van Buren was like, no, I think that's another a problem for a different day. We need to work on this slavery thing first. He didn't want the northern states to have less influence than the southern states because he was from the north. And he did not oppose slavery almost into the end of his life. All the time that he was in politics and he was president, he was pretty wishy-washy on slavery. He didn't really have any strong objections to it. And so as a political move, he was like, no on Texas. So, ready. Let's see. He eventually became an abolitionist and he supported Lincoln at the beginning of the war, but he died in 1862. So he didn't make it to the end of the war. He only made it 2 years into the war. And his father owned a slave who helped him run his tavern in Kinderhook, New York. And then it's not real clear, but once slavery was outlawed in New York, I think his father still hired the guy. Like he just paid him instead of making him a slave. So he was like, all right, you're a slave. All right, now I have to give you some money. I don't know how much changed. There's not a lot of facts about that. So his first employer was Peter Sylvester. He was a lawyer. He studied under him. Like I said, he never went to college. He just studied under a lawyer, and actually studied under two lawyers. It was Peter Sylvester, and then another man who became his mentor sent him to New York and to his brother, William Van Ness. Peter Van Ness was the guy who was his friend. He sent him to go work with his brother, William Van Ness, and he was good friends with Aaron Burr. Rumor actually had it that because nobody knew who Martin Van Buren's father was, because they'd never met him in Kinderhook, way out there, that his father was actually Aaron Burr, and he was coming to live with his father because they were such friends, and they kind of looked alike. And Aaron Burr was just a notorious ladies' man. So he went back to New York after he passed the bar. He got married to Hannah Hose. They had 6 children. Within 8 years, when she turned 85, she died of tuberculosis. He was a big part while he was in the Senate of ending debtors' prison, like where if you were in debt and you couldn't pay your debts, you would go to prison. He was a huge part of that bill that was sent to the Senate. And he said he wanted to end it because punishment was aimed at people who were having the misfortune of being poor. I thought that was kind of cool. Like I said, he had a rivalry with DeWitt Clinton, helped him gain the idea. And it was really his being defeated by DeWitt Clinton and his kind of group of cronies is what gave him the idea for the Democratic Party and how he kind of structured it. He knew he needed to have friends around him that could help him fight rivalries like that, his kind of battles. In the War of 1812, he campaigned for Andrew Jackson to be named a major general. And then Andrew Jackson went on to the Battle of New Orleans and won a huge decisive victory. Well, after the War of 1812, the peace treaty had been signed, but because, it takes a long time for paper to come back and forth on boats, they had the Battle of New Orleans, and it was crazy. It was like 200 British soldiers died, and only like 6 American soldiers. It was like one of the most lopsided battle victories of all time. And so that made Andrew Jackson a hero. So Andrew Jackson was like, their relationship was already going well. And then when he ran against John Quincy Adams, they both thought that the election had been stolen, which pretty much it had been. And Andrew Jackson swore the whole time that he's going to get back at him. And Martin Van Buren and his team of New York people fought hard against John Quincy Adams while he was president, basically making John Quincy Adams' presidency a no president. Like, he didn't really get a chance to get anything done because the Senate and the Congress were fighting against him all the time. He just really didn't have any help there. After when he was in the Senate as well, he worked for male suffrage, not female suffrage yet, and he wanted to give New York black male voters the right to vote if they had $250. They had to present that they had $250 before they could vote, which is kind of silly. It doesn't even say that they had to like pay $250. They just had to have it. They had to like show it so that they could vote. They're like, I have some money. That I guess that's the I have no idea how that works. Um, so we we talked about how he was asked to be the governor of New York, but said if Jackson wins, he was going to resign. He was only governor of New York. He was the shortest governor of New York ever, for like 2.5 months. And then he became the Secretary of State. He did very well there. He negotiated with the Ottoman Empire, gaining the U.S. access to trade in the Black Sea. He was the most trusted cabinet Jackson had. Let's see. I wrote like 5 pages of notes on Martin Van Buren and like 1.5 on William Henry Harrison. Oh, my book closed. That's all right. I have a bookmark in. So he organized the clearing of Jackson's cabinet. We talked about that. And let's see here. I'll just close the book. He came home, became vice president. I see when in writing all this, I remembered a lot of it. So that was great. He was elected in 1837. By the summer, the economy had collapsed and into the panic of 1837, which was awful. His solution was, because they were sending all these loans out and it was so difficult, his solution was, all right, well, land can only be bought. This is called a specie circular. Land can only be bought with gold and silver. So you had to buy your land with gold and silver. You couldn't buy it with banknotes. But that helped to start the Treasury Bill, which places these money back in private banks owned by the state, which was exactly the opposite of what Jackson was doing. But it really didn't help much. It's the economy was already in a free fall, so there was nothing really he could do about that. And he almost went to war with Canada, the UK, over Canada twice. The small area, if you look on a map, you kind of see it behind me over there, right by on top of New York, where the Niagara Falls is. There's a small area of land, and they wanted to become a U.S. State. And so they had broke away, and they had an island that they were basing their function out of in the Erie River. I think it's the Erie River, Niagara River, because Niagara Falls. And so a bunch of British ships came and they blew all those people up, sunk their boats. The U.S. was trying to send them supplies. They sunk the U.S. boat as well, and they sent it over the Niagara Falls. They were like, don't you dare send help to these Canadian rebels. We're not going to happen. And so they were able to, basically, he kind of said, okay, fine, whatever. We won't help them anymore, and kind of signed a treaty with the UK again. It was Great Britain back then. It's not the UK. I keep saying the UK. That's what they are now. And then in Maine, they had never really established firm boundary lines in Maine. And so the lumberjacks were coming into Maine wanting to get timber from Canada, and then the American farmers were wanting to farm, and they came to blows. They shot at each other a little bit. A really famous general went up there and got a treaty signed, and they started working on the actual boundaries of Maine and Canada. But yeah, almost went to war with the UK over Canada twice during his presidency. It was a horrible presidency. I feel bad for the guy, really. I mean, he really got dealt a rough hand as president. He also continued the removal of the southeastern tribes, which just was awful. The Seminole War started again. Just like the Trail of Tears was all during his presidency. Like it was awful. His presidency was bad. And a lot of it, he wasn't innocent, but a lot of it was engineered by Andrew Jackson, what Andrew Jackson wanted to do. And because they were so tightly tied together, he couldn't not do what Andrew Jackson was doing. Well, all of these problems came to a head when the Whig Party wanted to have a candidate. So the election that he was voted in, he ran against William Henry Harrison the first time, who was actually not that big of a politician before that. He had been the governor of a couple territories, and I'll talk about that in a little bit when I talk about his life. But he really hadn't done much. He ran 3 times, and on the third time, finally won his state Senate seat for the state of Ohio, I believe, if I'm reading that correctly. So he was a senator, and really, it was the first time anybody had campaigned. It was seen as crass to kind of the way they kind of described it was like, say you wrote a book and you wrote the foreword and the introduction to your own book is kind of what they thought about campaigning for president. So they thought that was horrible. They didn't want anybody to do that. They thought that was the worst thing in the world you could do. Other people needed to fight on your behalf for you to be president. But in this election is when that finally started. And William Henry Harrison, he had hired people to create songs. There was all kinds of songs created. They had posters. They had like people doing speaking tours talking about how Martin Van Buren had golden spoons and he was feeding everyone on golden. He was just opulent, and nobody knew how to deal with him and whatever. It was definitely one of those very interesting campaigns. He actually did. So if you just want casual fun facts, my kids love this book. It's Secret Lives of the U.S. Presidents by Cormac O'Brien. And if you look in here, they actually make fun of Martin Van Buren for his golden spoon. They do some artwork. And so I thought that was kind of cool. And so he was criticized for these lavish golden spoons, but really and seriously, he didn't. They were a gift to James Madison. They were just in the White House when he already got there. And then so William Henry Harrison, like all the cool fun facts are in here, and he has like nothing in this book. He has like his face, he's some cartoons, and then it really just talks about the fact like his election and when he was when he died. And like how they use some really archaic practices in his life. But another great book, which is even more detailed and better, is this one, which is The American President, Detailed Biographies, Historical Timelines from George Washington to Barack Obama by Catherine Moore. And I mean, this has some great facts. Like it goes through, this is the Martin Van Buren one. And it really helped me in my study when I got ready. I was getting ready for this, but it actually goes through the timeline of American events that are happening and then world events that are happening. And it has like ditties, talked about like the war, I talked about the Canadian War with Martin Van Buren. Cool thing about Martin Van Buren, the expression "okay" began being heard about the time of Van Buren's presidency. Some believe it refers to his old nickname, Old Kinderhook. And more likely, it was the popular expression used in New York and Boston when he was campaigning, called "old correct," or an intentional misspelling that was a Dutch misspelling of the word that he's okay. So it was like part of his campaign slogan was Martin Van Buren, he's okay. And so the expression "okay" came from his campaign. So he may have failed as president, but he gave us one of the most popular words that we say nowadays. Has great quotes from the presidents. So Martin Van Buren, as to the presidency, the 2 happiest days of my life were those of my entrance upon the office and my surrender of it. It didn't go well for him. Did you know that Martin Van Buren and his wife spoke Dutch in their home? That kind of thing. The population of the state, what the national debt was in 1841 when he became president. The president's salary at the time was $25,000 a year. Talks about the Panic of 1837. It's just a great book. So if you are interested in the presidents, you really are want to read one, this has been a great reference for me. The American President by Catherine Moore. So as we get ready for William Henry Harrison, I want to let you know I was bored reading his biography. I struggle with it. Here's his thing. But yeah, I found myself kind of going, I don't know. He fought against the Native Americans. That was kind of his great thing that he did. I really had a hard time writing about him, other than just his time as running for president, which I've kind of already talked about. Um, he was born in Virginia. He was the last president that was born before the Revolutionary War. Um, he was born February 9th, 1773, in 1841. He was the oldest president at that time that was elected. He was 68 years old when he was elected. Like I said, he had ran for president um, before, when he ran against Martin Van Buren the first time, and then he was of the Whig Party. So one of the things about the Whig Party is they were basically, the Federalist Party had to kind of rebrand itself, and so the Federalist Party went to a it wasn't necessarily an anti-slavery type party, but there was a lot of abolitionists in the Whig Party. And William Henry Harrison had kind of thought about being an abolitionist. He was from the territories of the North, so really not any states that were slave states. He kind of went into Indiana. I'm trying to think, where did it say that uh, he was the governor of the Northwest Territory, non-voting to the U.S. House for the Northwest Territory, governor of the Indiana Territory before it was a state. Then he finally became a U.S. representative, and then the Ohio State Senator and a U.S. Senator, and then the U.S. Minister to Columbia. Really, I don't know how he was able to figure out and create one of the craziest campaigns. Really, he ran off his fame with fighting the Native Americans, old Tippecanoe, the Battle of Tippecanoe, and he defeated the Native American general Tecumseh in the War of 1812, kind of near the roof, near Canada. I said the roof, but so he was fighting against. Ooh, I messed up the focus on the camera. Sorry, I did that. Here, hold on. Did I fix it? Let me hold it a little longer. Sorry. Darn it. I ruined the focus on the webcam. But yeah, he just wasn't that interesting. One of the cool things is that focus is bothering me now. I'm sorry. Here, hold on. Let me try this. That fixed it. All right. So I'm all distracted now. One of the things that he said, he wrote a letter of things he would do when he was president, like a list, and then he sent it in to a newspaper. And one of the things he said, he was only going to run for one term. Well, he succeeded in that. He only was around for 1 month. But his age. Now, I did watch a really cool video. I can't remember who put it out. I think it was Simon Whistler. He kind of does a bunch of like fact videos. He's kind of bald headed. He has a beard. He's a British guy, and he does a lot of interesting videos, like explaining things. I think his name's Simon Whistler, but he did a video on it could have been dysentery that William Henry Harrison died of, and like somebody had written a whole paper on it because there was like an outbreak of dysentery in Washington D.C. at the time. He had gotten a cold when he had the longest inauguration speech for over like 2.5 hours. He just talked and talked and talked and talked, and it rained the whole time. So he got a cold, but he got better from that cold when I'd always heard he wasn't wearing a coat. He was wearing a coat, but it was raining and it was cold, and so he got better from that cold. And then eventually he died. And they tried to heal him with like castor oil and like bleeding or something. It was like really antiquated practices. Like they didn't even do that anymore, but they tried to heal him that way, and he ended up dying. And so when next president, I think is going to be really interesting because John Tyler. I try to remember exactly what it was. I listened to it today when they talked about it. They described the way if a president dies while in office, there was something that happened. And it was like the vice president would uphold his duties until something, 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 something. And John Tyler took that to mean like, okay, that means I'm president. And like had himself sworn in. He like called people and he's like, all right, swear me in. Dude's dead. I'm president now. I got this. And it was really, really interesting. So I'm excited. So if you have an Audible membership, they have these free books. And I want you, if you get a chance, it's John Tyler, The Accidental President. They come and they go, so we may have to read it quickly. But by Edward P. Krappel. I can't get over the fact it's Krappel. I know that's wrong with me, but so that's the book I'm going to read. I've got it already downloaded on Audible. I'm going to start listening to it tomorrow, and hopefully be much better and not do the next live stream in a year. If you guys want more stuff about William Henry Harrison, I had a hard time reading his book. It's been a while since I read it. I wrote all these notes about Martin Van Buren, and then it got time to start writing notes about William Henry Harrison, and I just kind of I didn't have a great time with it. Gail Collins wrote his book. I've got it in here. I have a couple notes. Maybe I'll read. His grandson was also a president, Benjamin Harrison. He came on later. He ended up recruiting his own men when he was a soldier. It's kind of funny. Page 10, it says, I have a funny story about him in page 10. Let's go to page 10. Okay. Benjamin V, who the family reverend called the Singer, was larger than life, standing 6'4" and quickly going to fat. John Adams, who had an on-again, off-again relationship with him, called him Benjamin Jack Falstaff, after the Shakespearean actor. So this was his dad, I believe. Yes, Benjamin V was his dad. He was the governor of Virginia and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Stories about the Singer, his dad, abounded. During the Second Congressional Congress, when there was a quarrel over who would assume the chairman's role, Harrison picked up the hesitant John Hancock and literally dumped him into the seat of power. As the founders prepared to sign the Declaration of Independence, Harrison turned to the thin Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, grinned, and said, I shall have a great advantage over you, Mr. Gerry, when we are all hung for what we're doing. Given the weight of his body, Harrison pointed out, he would die quickly, while Gerry would dance in the air for an hour before he was dead. I mean, I guess his father was a bombastic, interesting man. So Gail Collins wrote this book. It's upside down. William Henry Harrison by Gail Collins. The only biography I can find that was really, I think there was another one that was written, not really talking about, it was talking about like his battles earlier on, the Battle of Tippecanoe and all that he was famous for, and the battles of 1812 where he was famous, but nobody really talked about his presidency because he didn't get a chance to do anything other than give a introductory speech and die. So, but he got to be the first president to die while in office, which was interesting. And then one of the two that died not of assassination, the other was FDR. So we will see you guys next time. I don't want to just ramble on about a president I find very interesting, but I'd love to hear in the comments if you found him interesting. I know a couple people read the book with me, and I would love to hear your thoughts. So I will talk to you guys very soon.